The fluorescent lights in the interview room hummed at a frequency that felt like a drill against my temple. But that mechanical whine wasn't nearly as loud as the memory of her breath against my neck from 12 hours ago. I stared at the woman sitting across the mahogany table. She was holding my portfolio, my entire future at the city's most prestigious firm, in hands that had grazed my forearm with electric intent just last night. The silence in the room was terrifying, smelling of stale coffee and high stakes. She clicked her pen, and the sound shattered the composure I'd spent all morning building. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, a visceral hum of attraction warring with professional panic, as I realized the stranger from the terrace was the one person who could destroy my career before it even started. The dream job I'd fought for was suddenly secondary to the terrifying realization that she knew exactly who I was under the suit. It had started at the Architects Guild Gala. The invitation promised networking. The reality was a sensory assault. The ballroom was a cavern of noise, a chaotic mix of clinking crystal and aggressive laughter that bounced off the vaulted ceilings. To my brain, the ambient roar wasn't just sound. It was physical pressure, a heavy blanket of static that made it hard to think, hard to breathe. The air was thick with the cloying scent of amber perfume and expensive gin, a chemical haze that stung my nose. I was doing what I always do to survive, mapping the exits and grounding myself by focusing on the texture of the cocktail napkin in my hand. It was linen, starched stiff, the weave rough against my thumb. A man in a velvet blazer was cornering me, talking loudly about the emotional integrity of brutalism, but his words were dissolving into the white noise. I nodded at the right intervals, but my focus was fracturing. I needed out. I needed quiet. I muttered a vague excuse about finding fresh air and slipped away, weaving through the tight clusters of people. I dodged a tray of champagne flutes and pushed through the heavy glass doors at the back of the room. The transition was instant. The roar of the party was severed, replaced by the damp, cool silence of the terrace. I took a deep breath, tasting rain and ozone, and leaned back against the cold stone wall. That's when I saw her. She was standing at the far end of the balustrade, looking out at the city skyline. She didn't turn around when the door clicked shut. She didn't flinch. She just stood there, a silhouette cut sharp against the glow of the skyscrapers. Her posture was striking, shoulders back, spine straight, but not stiff. It was the confident stillness of someone who doesn't need to check who just walked into the room, because she knows she owns the space regardless. She wore a dark coat that swallowed the light, and her hair was pulled back, exposing the elegant line of her neck. I felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to map that line with my eyes. I hesitated. The social script said I should leave or make polite noise. But something about her unbothered solitude pulled me in. It wasn't a rejection of company. It was a rejection of the chaos inside. I walked to the railing, leaving about 3 feet of distance between us, the universal metric for, I'm here, but I'm not demanding your attention. We stood there for a long minute, watching the red taillights bleed into the streets below. It wasn't awkward. It was a shared relief, a mutual acknowledgement that the world inside those glass doors was too much. I watched her hand tighten slightly on the stem of her wine glass. She didn't look at me, but I felt her awareness shift, a subtle change in the air pressure between us. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was low, a rich contralto that seemed to vibrate in the open air. The acoustics in there are a crime, she said, her gaze still fixed on the horizon. All that glass and polished concrete, it amplifies the noise until you can't hear yourself think. I laughed, a short, startled sound. I was just thinking it felt like being inside a blender set to high. She turned then, slowly. The movement was deliberate, fluid. When her eyes met mine, the ambient city light caught them. They were dark, intelligent, and completely unflinching. A blender, she repeated, a small, amused smile playing on her lips. That's generous. I was going to say a torture chamber for anyone who prefers substance over volume. You're not wrong, I said, relaxing my grip on the railing and turning to face her properly. It feels less like a celebration of architecture and more like a demolition derby of egos. I think I heard someone inside claiming they invented the concept of negative space. She chuckled, a low, resonant sound that felt like a bow drawn across a cello string, vibrating straight through the damp air and settling deep in my chest. That is the most accurate structural analysis I've heard all night. She turned fully toward me then, resting her hip against the stone balustrade. The distance between us was still polite, socially acceptable for two strangers on a terrace. But the attention she was giving me felt heavy, focused. It was the kind of gaze that didn't just look, it surveyed. It mapped the angles of my face with a precision that made my breath hitch. I'm assuming you're in the trade, she said, her eyes catching the reflection of the city lights. Civilians don't usually look that pained by bad acoustics. Architect, I confirmed. Or trying to be. Tonight is supposed to be about networking, about securing the future, but I'm mostly just trying not to hyperventilate near the shrimp tower. Networking. She rolled the word around her mouth like it was a curse in a dead language, distaste evident in the sharp line of her jaw. She took a step closer, invading the invisible buffer zone I usually kept around myself like a shield. But strangely, my internal alarm bells didn't ring. Usually proximity feels like a threat, a demand for performance or eye contact I can't sustain. With her, it felt like gravity. It felt like the only logical place to be. I have shaken hands with 300 suits tonight, she murmured, and her voice dropped an octave, becoming intimate, conspiratorial. And every single one of them wanted to talk about their projected quarterly billings or their golf handicap. Not one of them asked about the work. She leaned in then, breaking the social distance barrier completely. The damp, cool air between us suddenly felt fever hot. She lowered her voice to a whisper, a secret meant only for the two of us, suspended above the chaos of the city. I would give anything to be back at a drafting table right now. Just me, a blank sheet of vellum, and the silence. I miss the graphite. I miss the quiet logic of a problem that actually has a solution. Instead, I'm out here, playing the game. The confession hung in the air, raw and unexpected. It wasn't just small talk. It was a crack in the armor, a glimpse of the person beneath the polished exterior. I could smell her now, a complex, dark scent of sandalwood, old paper, and the sharp, clean smell of the coming rain. It was intoxicating, grounding me in a way the linen napkin never could. My heart did a slow, heavy roll in my chest. Then why are you here? I asked, my voice barely above a breath, terrified to break the spell. Because, she said, her eyes searching mine with an intensity that made my knees weak. Sometimes you have to wear the suit to protect the work. And sometimes, if you're lucky, you find the only other person in the room who's looking for the exit. She shifted, and her bare arm brushed against mine. The contact was electric, a sudden sharp jolt that traveled straight down my spine. It wasn't just skin on fabric. It was a circuit closing. The air around us thickened, charged with a tension that felt physical, coil tight. She didn't pull away. Neither did I. The noise of the city seemed to drop away entirely, leaving us in a vacuum of shared heat. Her gaze dropped to my mouth, lingered there, then tracked back up to my eyes, unflinching. It was a question and an invitation all at once. The pull was undeniable. I felt myself leaning in, drawn by a magnetic force that defied all my carefully constructed social logic. I wanted to map the tension away with a touch. I wanted to know if she tasted as expensive and complex as she smelled. The space between us shrank to nothing, filled only by the ragged sound of our breathing. Her hand slid along the railing, fingers inching toward mine until her pinky grazed my knuckle. It was a micro movement, but it felt like a tectonic shift. She started, her voice rough, stripped of its earlier confidence. She tilted her head, exposing the pulse point at her throat. I was inches away. The moment stretched, heavy and sweet, a held breath before the plunge. Then the terrace door exploded open. A burst of raucous laughter and aggressive jazz music poured out, shattering the bubble. We both jumped back like we'd been burned. A group of junior associates spilled onto the terrace, loud and oblivious, holding champagne flutes aloft. The connection snapped, leaving a physical ache in its wake. She straightened her coat, the mask of professional detachment sliding back into place instantly. But her eyes were still dark, pupil-blown, betraying the calm facade. "Duty calls," she said, though her voice was tight. She reached out one last time, her hand lingering on my forearm for a second longer than necessary, a silent acknowledgement of what almost happened. Her thumb pressed into my skin, a phantom brand. "Good luck tomorrow," she whispered, her voice a ghost of the intimacy we'd just shared. And then she was gone, slipping back into the noise, leaving me alone with the rain and the lingering scent of sandalwood. I woke before the alarm, my body humming with a restless, static energy that had nothing to do with caffeine. The morning light hit my pillow with the subtlety of a searchlight, bleaching out the gray shadows of my bedroom. But it couldn't burn away the phantom sensation of her breath on my neck. It was a physical imprint, a ghost map of where she had almost touched me. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling fan cutting lazy circles in the air, trying to compartmentalize. Today was the interview. Today was the culmination of 5 years of grad school and 3 years of grinding at a mid-tier firm. I couldn't afford to be distracted by a terrace confession and a stranger who seemed to have woven herself into my sheets. I got out of bed and began the ritual of construction. For me, dressing for an interview isn't just about hygiene. It's about structural engineering. I chose the charcoal suit, the one with the wool blend stiff enough to hold its shape even if I felt like crumbling inside. I buttoned the white shirt all the way to the collar, feeling the starch scratch against my throat, a necessary discomfort. It was a containment system. I needed to be sharp, angular, and impenetrable. I looked in the mirror and practiced my neutral face, the facade that hid the noise in my head and the sudden, terrifying hope in my chest. I told myself that the woman on the terrace was a fever dream, a glitch in the data. She didn't exist in the daylight. In the daylight, there were only blueprints, load-bearing walls, and the terrifying scrutiny of the partners at Kaufman and Hale. The firm was located in the Spire, a glass needle threading the sky in the financial district. Standing at the base of it, looking up at the sheer vertical drop of steel and reflective glazing, I felt that familiar crush of sensory data. The city noise here was different, mechanical, rhythmic, aggressive. I pushed through the revolving doors, timing my step to the rotation, and entered the lobby. The air conditioning was set to Arctic, and the air smelled of ozone, expensive leather, and anxiety. I checked in with the receptionist, a woman whose smile was a geometry problem I didn't have the bandwidth to solve. She handed me a visitor badge that felt heavy around my neck, a plastic tag marking me as an outsider. "They're ready for you in conference room B," she said, her voice clipped and professional. "Down the hall, last door on the left." The walk down that corridor felt like moving through a pressurized tube. The carpet was thick enough to silence my footsteps, which unnerved me. I rely on the auditory feedback of my own movement to feel grounded. Instead, there was just the low, subsonic hum of the HVAC system, a vibration I could feel in my teeth. I reached the heavy oak door, took a breath that didn't quite fill my lungs, and pushed it open. The room was vast, dominated by a long mahogany table that gleamed under the recessed lighting. The view from the floor-to-ceiling windows was spectacular, a panoramic sweep of the skyline we had looked at from the terrace just hours ago. But I didn't look at the view. I looked at the person sitting at the head of the table. The air in the room didn't just shift, it evaporated. Sitting there, reviewing a file with a gold fountain pen, was her. She wasn't wearing the dark coat from last night. She was in a tailored cream blazer that looked sharp enough to cut glass, her hair pinned back in a severe, elegant twist. But there was no mistaking the line of her jaw or the way her hands moved with deliberate economic grace. It was the woman from the terrace, the woman who had whispered about hating suits, the woman who had almost kissed me. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, bird-like rhythm that threatened to bruise. My fight or flight response triggered hard, adrenaline flooding my system. Was this a test? Had last night been some twisted psychological evaluation to see if I would crack under pressure? I felt the blood drain from my face, leaving me cold and exposed. She looked up. For a microsecond, I saw it. A flicker of recognition, a widening of the eyes that mirrored my own shock. The memory of the terrace flashed between us, hot and undeniable. But then, faster than a shutter clicking, the steel door slammed shut. Her expression smoothed into a pane of glass. The warmth that had been in her eyes last night, the sultry invitation, was gone. In its place was an unflinching, analytical gaze that felt less like a greeting and more like a structural assessment. "Ms. Martinez," she said, and her voice was the same rich contralto, but stripped of all its velvet. It was cool, distant, and utterly terrifying. "Please, take a seat. I'm Dorothy Hale, senior partner. I'll be conducting your final interview." She didn't smile. She didn't acknowledge the good luck she'd wished me 12 hours ago. She just gestured to the chair opposite her, turning the table into a battlefield. I walked forward, my legs feeling like they were moving through water, and sat down. The silence that stretched between us wasn't the comfortable quiet of the terrace. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a trap snapping shut. "Let's discuss the load paths in your thesis project." Dorothy didn't waste time with pleasantries. She opened my portfolio, her fingers, long, unadorned, clinical, tracing the lines of a suspension concept I'd spent 6 months perfecting. Her voice was a scalpel, precise and cold, dissecting the work I had poured my soul into. "You've prioritized the aesthetic of the tension cables over the redundancy of the support columns," she stated, not asking a question so much as leveling an accusation. "Explain that choice." I took a breath, forcing my brain to shift gears. The panic was still a static hum in my ears, but the blueprints were a language I spoke better than English. I focused on the ink, the geometry, the safe, predictable logic of physics. "It's about honesty in the materials," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "The tension cables are doing the work. Hiding them behind a facade of masonry columns would be a lie. It would suggest a stability that relies on mass, when the reality is that the structure relies on balance." Dorothy looked up, her eyes locked onto mine, and the atmosphere in the room tightened, coiling like a spring. "Honesty," she repeated. The word hung there, heavy and double-edged. "You believe that exposing the structural reality is always preferable to a polished facade. I believe that if the structure is sound, it doesn't need to be hidden, I countered, meeting her gaze. And if it's not sound, no amount of cladding will save it. The subtext screamed between us. We weren't talking about steel and concrete anymore. We were talking about the gala, about the terrace, about the polished senior partner suit she was wearing and the raw, whispered confession she'd shared in the dark. She was testing me. She was asking if I could keep a secret, or perhaps if I was the kind of person who would strip away her armor in front of the board.
Interesting, she murmured, though her face remained a perfect, unreadable mask. She pushed a blank pad of vellum across the mahogany table toward me. Show me. Resolve the shear force at the connection point in the atrium. If you remove the cladding, how do you handle the wind load without compromising the visual line?
I picked up the drafting pencil. The hexagonal barrel felt familiar, a grounding totem against the slick sweat on my palms. I started to sketch. My hand moved in rapid, rhythmic strokes, the graphite biting into the paper with a satisfying scritch-scratch sound that cut through the terrifying silence. I didn't look up, but I could feel her watching. It wasn't the passive observation of an interviewer. It was a tactile weight. I could feel her gaze tracking the movement of my fingers, assessing the steadiness of my line, dissecting my process as ruthlessly as she had my portfolio. She stood up. The sound of her chair scraping back was a gunshot in the quiet room. She walked around the table, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor with a slow, predatory cadence. She stopped behind my right shoulder. The distance between us vanished. I could feel the heat radiating from her body, a physical warmth that mocked the Arctic temperature of the room. She leaned forward to inspect the sketch, placing one hand on the table next to my arm. Her thumb brushed the edge of the paper, inches from my wrist. I didn't smell sandalwood this time. I smelled the crisp starch of her shirt and the faint metallic tang of expensive ink. It was a scent of power, of absolute control. "You're increasing the tensile strength here," she said, her voice dropping that dangerous octave, vibrating right near my ear. "But you're leaving the anchor point exposed." "It has to be exposed," I whispered, unable to raise my voice. I kept drawing, but the lines were harder to control now. My focus was splintering under the pressure of her proximity. If you bury the anchor, you can't inspect it for fatigue. You won't know it's failing until it snaps. "And you think you can handle that?" She leaned closer, her breath ghosting against the shell of my ear. "The constant visibility? The risk that everyone can see exactly where the stress is accumulating?" My hand froze. The pencil hovered over the paper. The air in the room was thick, charged with a tension that felt physical. I turned my head slightly, just enough to see her profile. She was looking at the drawing, her expression tight, her lips parted slightly. But she didn't break. There was no softening in her eyes, no return to the terrace intimacy. She was a wall of reinforced concrete, impenetrable and cold. Then she pulled back. The space between us returned, absolute and chilling. She walked back to her chair, the moment of potential connection severed as cleanly as if she'd used a guillotine. "Technically, it works," she said, her voice flat. She sat down and closed the portfolio. "But this firm isn't just about engineering. It's about client perception. Clients like to feel safe, Ms. Martinez. They don't always appreciate being reminded of the gravity holding them down." I set the pencil down, my fingers trembling. The doubt crashed over me. Had I misread the entire interaction on the terrace? Was the whispered confidence just a game she played? I felt the familiar, cold slide of imposter syndrome. I was a fraud. I was a chaotic, neurodivergent mess who had projected a romantic fantasy onto a powerful woman who was just looking for fresh air. She wasn't flirting with me last night. She was just bored. And now, She was dissecting me. I understand, I said, my voice sounding small in the cavernous room. But I prefer to build things that stand up because they're strong, not because they're covered up. Dorothy stared at me for a long beat, her face unreadable. We'll see, she said finally. She checked her watch. We're done with the technical assessment. Let's see how you handle the rest of the team. The transition from the hermetic seal of Dorothy's office to the general floor was a physical blow. She opened the door, and the airlock broke. The team she had mentioned wasn't a group of colleagues. It was a wall of sound. The firm prided itself on an open concept layout, a design choice that translates to sensory nightmare for a brain that processes every input at the same volume. We walked into the bullpen, a sprawling landscape of glass desks and manic energy. Phones rang with jagged, discordant tones that seemed to scrape against my skull. 3 conversations were happening simultaneously within 10 feet of me, the voices overlapping into a muddy, unintelligible roar. The fluorescent lights here were brighter than in the conference room, bouncing off the polished concrete floors and stabbing directly into my optic nerve. A group of junior associates descended on us immediately, their energy chaotic and eager. They were asking questions about my background, about the firm, about where I went to school, but their mouths were moving out of sync with the audio track in my head. So, did you work on the Henderson project? One of them asked, leaning too close. The smell of his cologne was sharp, chemical. What's your preferred rendering software? Asked another, tapping a tablet with a stylus that made a rhythmic tink, tink, tink sound. My focus began to splinter. It's a physical sensation, like a pane of glass developing a spiderweb fracture. I could feel my breathing turn shallow, the air getting stuck in my throat. I needed to ground myself. My hand went to the pen in my pocket, my thumb flicking the clip up and down, a rapid, rhythmic stim to burn off the excess static flooding my nervous system. I tried to answer the questions, but the words felt heavy, clumsy in my mouth. I was nodding, smiling, masking with everything I had, but the structure was failing. The room tilted. The sheer volume of data, the whine of a printer, the aggressive pattern of the carpet, the proximity of too many bodies was overwhelming my ability to process it. I was seconds away from shutting down completely. Then, the noise stopped. Or rather, the source of the noise was severed. That's enough, Dorothy said. She didn't shout. She didn't even raise her voice. She just cut through the chaos with a tone of absolute calm authority. The associates froze. Dorothy stepped between me and the group, creating a physical barrier with her body. She wasn't looking at them. She was looking at my hand, at the way my thumb was punishing the clip of my pen. She saw the fracture. Ms. Martinez needs to see the archives before we head to the site, Dorothy stated, her voice smooth and brooking no argument. The historical plans are relevant to her thesis on structural honesty. We'll catch up with you later. Before I could process the rescue, she was guiding me away. Her hand hovered near the small of my back without actually touching me, a protective, guiding presence that felt like a shield. She led me down a side corridor, away from the light and the noise, and swiped her badge at a heavy steel door. The archive room was a vault of silence. The door hissed shut behind us, sealing out the electronic hum of the office. The air here was cool and still, smelling of dust, cedar, and aging vellum. It was instantly grounding. The sensory assault vanished, replaced by the hushed reverence of a library. I exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that emptied my lungs of the panic. My hand dropped from the pen. My shoulders, which had been hiked up to my ears, finally dropped. I leaned against a flat file cabinet, closing my eyes for a second to recalibrate. When I opened them, Dorothy was watching me. But the predatory assessment from the interview room was gone. In its place was the woman from the terrace, observant, knowing, and startlingly gentle. She wasn't looking at a candidate who couldn't handle the pressure. She was looking at a person who needed the volume turned down.
Better? She asked softly.
Much, I managed, my voice steadying in the quiet. The open plan, it's a lot of input. It's an acoustic disaster, she corrected, walking over to a shelf and pulling down a roll of blueprints. Not because we needed to look at them, but to give us a reason to be there. It prioritizes visibility over thought. I hate it. She unrolled the plans on the table between us. It was a pretense, and we both knew it. She hadn't brought me here to test my knowledge of historical zoning laws. She brought me here because she saw me drowning, and she knew exactly what kind of life raft I needed. Most people don't notice, I said, looking down at the blue lines without really seeing them. They think I'm just being difficult or shy.
I notice, Dorothy said. She looked up from the plans, her dark eyes locking onto mine.
The unflinching quality of her gaze had shifted again. It wasn't interrogating me, it was holding me. I saw you counting the exits at the gala. I saw you mapping the quietest corners. You navigate space by how it feels, not just how it looks. That's not a weakness, Lola. It's a diagnostic tool. She used my first name. The sound of it in her mouth, spoken in the quiet dark of the archives, felt like a caress. The professional distance she had erected in the boardroom was dissolving, not into the flirtation of the party, but into something deeper. Empathy. She understood the wiring of my brain without me having to explain a single circuit. Thank you, I whispered.
Don't thank me, she murmured, rolling the plans back up with a decisive snap. We have a site visit to get to. But I thought you might prefer the construction elevator to the main lobby. It's louder, but
it's empty, I finished for her. Exactly. A small conspiratorial smile touched her lips, the first real smile she'd given me all day. It was a secret shared in the dark, a suture binding us together. Come on, let's get out of here. We stepped out of the spire's climate-controlled perfection and into the humid, gritty reality of the street. The 2-block walk to the new Hale Kaufman site felt like shedding a skin. The air grew heavier, smelling of wet asphalt and exhaust, stripped of the office's ozone sterility. When we crossed the perimeter fence, the atmosphere shifted entirely. To most, a construction site is a cacophony, drills screaming, metal clanging, engines roaring. But to me, it was a rhythm I understood. The percussive thud of the pile driver wasn't random noise. It was the heartbeat of the build. Here, nothing was hidden behind drywall or polite euphemisms. The structure was exposed, vulnerable, and real. I felt my lungs expand, the tightness in my chest loosening with every step into the dust. We bypassed the main trailer and headed straight for the construction hoist, a rattling metal cage clinging to the exterior of the rising tower. Dorothy swiped her badge and the heavy gate clattered open. We stepped inside, and the operator, a man who looked like he was carved from the same granite as the foundation, slammed the grate shut. The motor engaged with a mechanical groan that vibrated through the soles of my boots, and we jerked upward. The ride was loud, a grinding symphony of gears and wind that drowned out the city below. It created a cone of isolation, a mechanical privacy that felt more intimate than the silent archive room. As the ground fell away, the city turned into a grid of lights and geometry. But my focus remained entirely on the woman standing 6 inches from me. The cage was small. Every time the car rattled over a joint in the track, our shoulders brushed. The vibration of the elevator traveled through the floor, humming in my bones, blurring the line between the machine's energy and my own nervous system. "Lola," she said. She didn't shout. She leaned in, speaking near my ear to be cut through the wind. Forget the interview for a second. Forget the job description. I turned my head. Her face was inches from mine, framed by the white hard hat. Her eyes weren't tired or guarded now. They were fierce, bright with the same raw energy that pulsed through the site. She gestured through the mesh at the exposed steel skeleton of the tower as we passed the 30th floor.
"What do you see?" she asked.
Not the load paths, not the math. What do you see? I looked at the beams, the rivets, the raw, unfinished reality of the building rising against the sky. I saw the struggle of physics, the way the steel groaned under the weight it was asked to carry, and the stubborn refusal of the materials to yield. I see the tension, I said, my voice caught by the wind but steady. I see a structure that is holding itself up before it's even finished. It's ugly and it's messy, but it's resilient. I looked back at her, holding her gaze. It's honest. Dorothy watched me, and the air between us charged with a different kind of electricity. Not the static of anxiety, but the heavy, magnetic pull of recognition. She wasn't looking at a candidate. She was looking at a mirror. The wind whipped a strand of hair across her face, but she didn't move to fix it. She just stood there, swaying slightly with the movement of the cage, grounded in the chaos. That, she said, her voice vibrating in my chest, low and undeniable, is exactly what I see. The elevator jolted to a halt at the 40th floor, swinging slightly in the wind. The operator threw the gate open, but for a long, suspended moment, neither of us moved toward the exit. We remained in the rattling cage, suspended 400 feet in the air, held up by temporary steel and a tension that felt strong enough to support the entire building. The heat radiating from her arm where it brushed mine was a physical weight, a silent confirmation that the blueprints we were looking at weren't the only things being built in the dark. The operator threw the gate open, and the world rushed in. We stepped out onto the 40th floor, a sprawling expanse of cured concrete and open sky where the walls hadn't yet risen to shut out the horizon. The wind up here was violent, a constant, heavy pressure that pushed against my chest and whipped the tails of my suit jacket. To anyone else, it might have been terrifying, the sheer drop at the edge protected only by safety cables and netting. But to me, the exposure was clarifying. There was no fluorescent hum here. There was no social pretense. There was only the brutal, beautiful physics of wind load and gravity. Dorothy walked toward the perimeter with a fearlessness that made my throat tight. She navigated the uneven floor, stepping over bundles of rebar and power conduits without breaking her stride, her gaze fixed on the structural columns that formed the building's spine. I followed, my boots crunching on the dust and grit. I watched the way she moved, efficient, balanced, completely at home in the chaos of the build. It was a stark contrast to the polished executive in the boardroom, yet somehow this version of her felt more authentic. The wind tore at her hair, pulling strands loose from her severe twist, softening the geometry of her face until she looked less like a monument and more like the woman who had leaned against the wet stone of the terrace. We stopped near the southwest corner, where the view opened up to a panoramic sweep of the harbor. The city below was a toy set, a grid of silent movement. But up here, the roar of the wind erased it all. "The sheer wall," Dorothy said, her voice raised just enough to carry over the gale, pointing to the massive reinforced concrete slab behind us. We had to redesign the rebar density 3 times to account for the torsion. The engineers wanted to thicken the wall, but I refused. "Because it would have eaten into the floor plate," I shouted back, nodding. I understood the logic instantly. You kept the slim profile by increasing the steel ratio. It's riskier during the pour, but it pays off in the usable square footage. She turned to look at me, a spark of approval lighting her dark eyes. Exactly. Most people just see a wall. They don't see the negotiation between space and stability. I went to respond, but a sudden gust caught the loose end of my high-visibility vest. The nylon strap whipped up, the plastic buckle striking my jaw with a sharp, stinging clack. I flinched, the sudden sensory spike disrupting my train of thought. The wind caught it again, a rhythmic, chaotic flapping that started to grate against my nervous system like sandpaper. I reached up, fumbling with the twisted nylon, trying to thread the buckle back through the loop to secure it. My fingers, cold from the wind and stiff with adrenaline, wouldn't cooperate. The strap twisted further, a small, frustrating puzzle that I couldn't solve while maintaining eye contact with the woman who held my career in her hands.
"Stop," Dorothy said. She didn't wait for permission. She stepped into the space I was trying to defend. The buffer zone evaporated. She stood directly in front of me, shielding me from the wind with her body. The sudden drop in wind pressure around me was startling, a pocket of quiet in the middle of the storm. "You're fighting the tension," she murmured, her voice dropping below the register of the wind, intimate and grounding. "You have to create slack before you can fix the alignment." She reached out. Her hands, warm and steady, covered my freezing fingers. She gently moved my hands aside and took hold of the twisted strap. I stopped breathing. The contact was electric, a current that had nothing to do with the static of the storm. I watched her lashes lower as she focused on the plastic clip, her face inches from my chest. I could feel the heat radiating from her, a physical presence that anchored me to the concrete slab more effectively than gravity ever could. Her knuckles grazed the hollow of my throat as she worked the nylon. It was a feather-light touch, accidental yet searing, sending a shockwave straight down my spine. The smell of her, that dark, complex mix of sandalwood and rain, filled my senses, overriding the dust and the ozone. It was the scent of the terrace, the scent of safety. "There," she whispered. The clip snapped into place with a decisive click. She didn't step back. Her hands lingered on the lapels of the vest, smoothing the mesh over my shoulders. It was a possessive, protective gesture. She looked up, and for a long, suspended moment, we weren't employer and applicant. We were just two bodies, occupying the same charged space. Her gaze dropped to my mouth, heavy and unhurried, before dragging back up to my eyes. The sultry tension from the elevator hadn't dissipated. It had crystallized. "Better?" she asked, her voice rough. "Much," I managed, my voice sounding wrecked to my own ears. She held my gaze for a second longer, a second that felt like a promise, before she finally stepped back, letting the wind rush into the space between us again. But the cold didn't register anymore. I was burning. "We've seen enough," she said, turning back toward the hoist, though her movements were slower now, less crisp. "Let's go down. We have things to discuss." The ride down was silent, but it wasn't the empty silence of the ascent. It was heavy, saturated with the things we hadn't said on the 41st floor. We stood side by side, not touching, but the air between us was so thick with awareness, it felt like a third passenger in the cage. I watched the numbers on the hoist display count down, each floor bringing us closer to the ground, closer to the reality of the office, and closer to the moment where we would have to decide if this structure we were building could actually hold the weight. By the time we returned to the executive suite, the light had changed. The harsh, interrogating glare of the afternoon sun had softened into a bruised, purple twilight that bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows. It cast long, architectural shadows across the drafting tables outside Dorothy's office, turning the workspace into a landscape of charcoal and indigo. The bullpen was empty now, the chaotic hum of the junior associates replaced by the low, rhythmic thrum of the building settling for the night. It was the kind of quiet I usually coveted, a soothing lack of input that allowed my brain to unclench. But right now, it felt heavy. It felt like the drop in barometric pressure before a storm breaks. We walked into her private office, and the door clicked shut with a finality that echoed in my chest. This was it. The site visit was over. The technical defense was done. The sensory tests
were complete. Now, there was only the truth left to navigate. Dorothy walked behind her desk, the glass surface reflecting the city lights that were just starting to flicker on below, like a constellation of inverted stars. She didn't sit down immediately. She stood there, her back to the window, a silhouette framed by the very skyline we had discussed on the terrace. She looked tired. The crisp, terrifying perfection of her senior partner persona had frayed at the edges. There was dust on the hem of her cream blazer from the construction site, a smudge of graphite on her thumb. It made her look real. It made her look less like a titan of industry and more like the woman who had leaned against the balustrade and confessed she hated suits. She picked up my file, her fingers hovering over the clasp. She didn't open it. She just stared at the name on the cover, as if it were a riddle she couldn't solve. I stood on the other side of the desk, refusing to sit in the candidate's chair. I needed to be on my feet, grounded, feeling the floor beneath my soles. The static in my head was building again, a crescendo of anxiety and unanswered questions that demanded resolution. I had spent the entire day masking, filtering my reactions, translating my neurodivergent impulses into acceptable corporate behavior. I was exhausted. I needed clarity. I needed to know the rules of engagement. "We need to talk about it," I said. My voice sounded loud in the quiet room, stripped of the deferential tone I'd forced myself to use during the interview. It was the voice of the woman from the terrace. Dorothy looked up, her hand freezing on the file. The shadows hid her eyes, but I could feel the weight of her gaze. "Talk about what, Ms. Martinez?" "About last night," I said, stepping closer to the desk, invading the professional perimeter she was trying to reestablish. "About the terrace. About the fact that for the last 6 hours, we've been playing a game of doublespeak where structural integrity actually means emotional honesty. I need to know if I'm here because I'm qualified or if I'm here because you felt guilty about almost kissing a stranger." The words hung in the air, sharp and dangerous. It was a breach of protocol, a direct challenge to her authority. But I couldn't play the game anymore. Dorothy's grip on the file tightened until her knuckles turned white. Then, she let go. She picked up her gold fountain pen, held it for a second, and then let it drop. It hit the glass desk with a sharp clatter that sounded like a surrender. "I almost canceled," she admitted. Her voice was low, devoid of the command she'd wielded on the construction site. She looked down at the pen, watching it roll to a stop against her notebook. "When I saw your name on the schedule this morning, when I realized the Lola from the terrace was the L. Martinez with the suspension thesis, I panicked." "You panicked?" I asked, the skepticism leaking into my tone. "You're the most composed person I've ever met. You don't panic." "It's a structure, Lola," she said, looking up at me. The use of my first name again sent a shiver through me, a visceral reminder of the intimacy we were dancing around. "It's a facade. I built it to survive in a room full of men who think empathy is a weakness in design. But last night I took the scaffolding down. I let you see the cracks." She walked around the desk, moving slowly, closing the distance between us. I told myself I should recuse myself, that it was a conflict of interest, that I couldn't be objective. "So why didn't you?" "Because I had to know," she whispered. She stopped 3 feet away, the same distance we'd maintained on the terrace before the world intruded. I had to know if the brilliance I heard in the dark held up in the light. I had to know if the connection was just the atmosphere, the wine, the desperate need for an escape, or if it was real. "And?" I challenged, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "What's the verdict? Is the structure sound?" "It's terrifyingly sound," she said. She reached out, her hand hovering between us, trembling slightly. It was a crack in the perfection that I wanted to map with my own fingers. "You answered every challenge I threw at you. You navigated the chaos of the bullpen. You saw the beauty in the raw steel of the site. You aren't just a good architect, Lola. You see the world exactly the way I do.
Then what's the problem? I asked, though I knew the answer.
I could feel the problem vibrating in the air between us. It was the policy manual. It was the HR department. It was the unspoken rule that partners don't look at associates the way she was looking at me right now. The problem, Dorothy said, taking a breath that juddered in her chest, is that I am about to offer you the job. And the moment I do that, you become my employee. And everything that happened on that terrace, the whispered confidence, the hand on your arm, the way I wanted to map the line of your neck, it all becomes forbidden. She turned back to the desk, picked up a heavy, cream-colored envelope, and held it out to me. Her hand was steady now, the professional mask trying to reassert itself. But her eyes were pleading. "This is the offer," she said, her voice formal but brittle. "It's everything you worked for." I looked at the cream-colored envelope. It was heavy, weighted with the potential of my entire career. But she didn't let go. Her fingers remained clamped on the corner, creating a physical bridge between us that hummed with a frequency I could feel in my teeth. "But," Dorothy continued, and the word hung there, suspending the moment, "there is a condition, not a contractual one, a personal one." She looked at me, her dark eyes searching mine for the answer to a question she hadn't asked yet. The sun had fully set now, leaving the room in a soft, gray gloom, illuminated only by the city lights reflecting off the glass. In the semi-darkness, the hierarchy of the interview room felt irrelevant. There was only the gravity pulling us together, undeniable and terrifying. "What's the condition?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "You have a choice," she said, her voice thick with the same sultry tension that had been on the terrace. "You take the job, and inside these walls, we are professionals. We are architect and senior partner. We talk about load paths and shear forces and deadlines." She took a step closer, the envelope still held between us like a shield or a promise. "You need to understand the architecture of this role before you accept it," she said, her voice shifting back into that crisp executive register, though her eyes remained dark and dangerous. "This isn't just a job, it's a consumption. I expect your drafts to be flawless. I expect you to defend your choices against partners who have been building since before you were born. I expect you to lose sleep, to obsess over details no one else will see, and to care more about the integrity of a joint than you do about your own comfort." "I don't want comfort," I replied, my voice steady despite the way my pulse was jumping in my throat. "I want to build things that matter." "Good," she murmured, "because inside these walls, that is all you will get. I will push you harder than anyone else because I know exactly what you're capable of. I won't go easy on you just because I know the texture of your voice in the dark." The distinction hung in the air, sharp and absolute. She was drawing a boundary line, sketching a wall between the day and the night. It was a compartmentalization that appealed to my need for structure, for clear rules. But rules are static. What was happening between us was dynamic, fluid, and alive. "And outside these walls?" I asked, the question barely more than an exhale. Dorothy closed the final distance. She didn't touch me yet, but I could feel the heat radiating from her body, a tangible force field of intent. She reached out and placed her hand over mine, the one clutching the offer letter. Her skin was warm, her grip firm, but careful, as if she were handling a rare, volatile material. "Outside these walls," she whispered, her voice dropping that octave again, vibrating straight through my sternum. "The hierarchy dissolves. Outside, there are no partners or associates. There's just the woman who hates suits and the woman who counts exits." She paused, her thumb brushing the pulse point on my wrist, sending a jolt of electricity up my arm that nearly made me drop the file. I need to know if you can handle that duality, Lola, because I won't start this if we're going to let the structure collapse under the weight of the secret. I looked at her, really looked at her. I saw the fatigue behind the perfection, the loneliness she had confessed to on the terrace, and the fierce, terrifying intelligence that matched my own. This wasn't just a job offer. It was a proposition for a dual life. It was a blueprint for a relationship built on the tension between professional distance and intimate proximity. I told you, I said, my voice rough. I like honesty in my materials. And this, I glanced down at where her hand covered mine, then back up to her lips. This feels like the most honest thing in the room. The tension that had been coiling tight since the moment I walked into the interview room finally snapped. Dorothy made a low sound in her throat, a surrender to the gravity pulling us together. She moved her hand from my wrist to my waist, pulling me in, while her other hand tangled into the hair at the nape of my neck. "Then sign the papers later," she breathed. She kissed me. It wasn't the frantic, stolen kiss of two people trying to hide. It was slow, deliberate, and agonizingly thorough. It was a savoring. Her lips were soft, tasting of the dark roast coffee we'd been smelling all morning, and something uniquely her, warm, complex, and intoxicating. I melted into it, the stiffness of my candidate posture dissolving instantly. My hands found purchase on the lapels of her cream blazer, the tactile contrast of the smooth, expensive silk lining against the rough wool of my suit jacket, sending a sensory overload through my fingertips. The world narrowed down to this single point of contact. The hum of the HVAC, the city lights, the terrifying stakes of the career I was about to launch, it all faded into background noise. The only data that mattered was the pressure of her mouth moving against mine, the firm, grounding weight of her hand on my back, and the sound of her breathing hitching as I deepened the kiss. It felt like a suture pulling tight, closing a wound I hadn't realized I was carrying. It was a structural connection so perfect, so inevitable, that I wondered how I had ever stood upright without it. She pulled back slowly, her forehead resting against mine, our breath mingling in the quiet office. Her eyes were blown wide, dark and unguarded, stripped of all professional armor. "So," she whispered, her thumb tracing the line of my jaw, mapping the bone structure with a reverence that made my knees weak. "Do we have a deal?" I tightened my grip on her lapels, grounding myself in the reality of her warmth. "I'll take the job, Dorothy. And I'll take the condition." "Good," she said, a small, genuine smile curving against my skin. "Because I have a feeling the overtime is going to be extensive." 3 months have passed since the ink dried on my offer letter, sealing the contract of our dual existence. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors of the Spire, our choreography is flawless. We are a masterclass in professional distance. She calls me Ms. Martinez in front of the junior associates, her voice clipped, cool, and stripped of the velvet warmth I know exists beneath the surface. I hand her files during the Monday morning partner meetings with a steady hand, never letting our fingers brush, never letting my gaze linger on the pulse point at her throat that I know tastes like salt. We built the wall we promised, and it is load-bearing. It holds up the weight of the firm, the expectations of the partners, and the rumors that always circulate but never find purchase because we give them absolutely nothing to hold on to. It is a grueling performance, a high-wire act of masking that leaves me drained by 6 o'clock, but the structural integrity holds. But every wall has a hidden door, if you know where to look. Tonight, the rain is hammering against the windows of my apartment, a chaotic, percussive rhythm that usually makes my skin itch with sensory overload. But tonight, it's just background texture, a soft, gray noise layered under the quiet jazz playing low on the speaker. The senior partner is gone. Dorothy is sitting on my living room rug, surrounded by a sea of vellum, red-line drafts, and trace paper. The terrifying cream blazer is draped over a kitchen chair. The lethal heels are kicked off by the door. She's wearing one of my oversized sweaters, the charcoal wool, soft and worn, her legs tucked under her in a casual geometry she would never allow in the boardroom. We are working. It's what we do. It's the language we speak. But this isn't the frantic, performative work of the office. This is parallel play, the specific, holy intimacy of being alone together. I'm sketching a facade detail for the riverfront project, the graphite soft and smudged on my fingers. She's reviewing contracts for the new stadium, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. We haven't spoken in an hour. For a neurodivergent brain, this silence is the ultimate luxury. It's a silence that doesn't demand processing. I don't have to map her mood, filter my fidgeting, or translate my thoughts into corporate speak. I can just be. I stop drawing for a moment, letting the pencil rest, and just watch her. She's chewing on the end of a stylus, her brow furrowed in a knot of concentration. She looks younger like this, softer, the sharp angles of her ambition smoothed out by the domestic light. She feels my gaze, she always does, a radar tuned specifically to my frequency, and looks up. The transition is instantaneous. Her dark eyes soften, the sharp analytical focus melting into a warmth that curls my toes. "You're staring, Lola," she murmurs, a small, private smile playing on her lips. "I'm inspecting the structural integrity," I counter, leaning back on my hands and stretching my legs out until my foot brushes her knee. "And it's holding. No cracks in the foundation." She laughs, that low, resonant cello sound that vibrates straight through my chest and crawls across the blueprints, heedless of the creases she's putting in the elevation drawings. She stops next to me, sliding her hand over mine where it rests on the sketch. Her palm is warm, her fingers interlacing with mine, grounding me in the present. The sensation is an anchor, closing the gap between the two halves of my life. The lines between work and love, between the architect and the partner, blur into this single, perfect point of contact. We built a glass house in a stone world, and somehow, against all the odds, it hasn't shattered. The memory of that terrace whisper, "I hate suits," has merged with the reality of our shared silence, creating a blueprint for a life I never thought I could engineer. We took a risk on a foundation that shouldn't have worked, proving that sometimes the most stable structures are the ones built on the most dangerous ground. If you've ever found clarity in the chaos or found a connection that defied the blueprints, hit subscribe and share your story in the comments. Until next time, keep building.